Mr Speaker, I present the bill for an Act to establish the First Nations Treaty Institute to prepare a framework for treaty negotiations with Aboriginal peoples and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and to support Aboriginal peoples and Torres Strait Islander peoples to participate in treaty negotiations, to provide for the establishment of the Truth-Telling and Healing Inquiry, to inquire into the continuing impacts of colonisation on Aboriginal peoples and the Torres Strait Islander peoples, and to amend this Act. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Communities Justice Land and Other Matters Act 1984 and the Fire and Emergency Services Act 1990 for particular purposes. I table the bill, the explanatory notes and a statement of compatibility with human rights, and I nominate the Community Support and Services Committee to consider the bill.
Yeah.
Mr Speaker, let me begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we meet and live. I pay my respects to elders past and present, and I extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. I recognise the richness, strength and diversity of First Nations' continuing cultures and connections to the lands, waters and seas of the place we call Queensland, and I honour Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's knowledge and ways of knowing. I know that this is an important day for my parliamentary colleagues, especially for Minister Leanne Enoch, a Quandamooka woman and member for Algesta, Cynthia Louie, Lamalag woman and member for Cook, the first Torres Strait Islander person to hold a seat in any parliament of Australia. Yeah. Lance McCallum, a Gubbi Gubbi man and member for Bundamba. Yeah. I also acknowledge respected elders, members of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities here today and in person, or who have tuned into Parliament TV online to bear witness to this significant bill.
Yeah.
At the outset, I wish to advise that during this speech, the names of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who have passed will be mentioned. I take this step in order to share proud stories of leaders who have created pathways in the past that allow us to take the next steps into the future. Mr Speaker, one of the things that I feel a great sense of disappointment about is that I first read the historian Henry Reynolds' books while studying documents relating to our colonial history in the British Library in London. Not in a Queensland classroom where such history should have been taught. I was reading court documents I had not read or even heard of at school in Queensland. I've never forgotten what I discovered. Deep in these documents were directions from the British Colonial Office to make treaties. Reynolds points out the contradiction of the British treatment of Indigenous peoples in Canada, Northern America and New Zealand with what happened here in Australia. In those countries, the possession of lands by First Nations people were recognised and was negotiated. There were treaties between the Crown and the peoples of those nations. Some were better than others. The British Colonial Office had insisted on them, especially following the Tasmanian massacres, but no treaty was ever entered into here. The question is why? The right to property is a basic tenet of British law. As we Australians know, even the theft of a loaf of bread back in the day could result in the most extreme of punishments, ensuring a one-way passage to Australia. So how do we explain the theft of an entire country? Reynolds found that the British had relied on description from Joseph Banks during Cook's expedition of an unoccupied, sparsely populated land. This notion of an unoccupied land was upheld in court cases and Privy Council rulings all through the 1800s, despite much evidence to the contrary coming from Australia. It suited the times, and we remained terra nullius until Eddie Koiki Mabo and the landmark High Court ruling decided differently in 1982. Mr Speaker, this is our chance to do what we should have done 2 centuries ago, to make a treaty or treaties with Aboriginal peoples and Torres Strait Islanders people. Yeah. Mr Speaker, there are rare moments in time, perhaps just once in a generation or even once in several generations, where we have an opportunity to be true agents of change. Queensland's path to treaty is such a moment. Yeah. It is a moment which will define our humanity, our sense of fairness and the legacy we leave to our children. Martin Luther King Jr. reminded us that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Dr. Jackie Huggins reminds us that the path to treaty, it is about how we mend the very fabric of our society here in Queensland and how we are able to walk together on this land we now share. The history of this place we call Queensland and the people who live here stretches across tens of thousands of years. It is a history nurtured and preserved in the cultures of the first peoples of many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nations. Over the past 2.5 centuries, the history of our state has been shared by those who've come from across the seas. We acknowledge that parts of our shared history tell true stories of deep injustice, of wrongs perpetrated against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, the effects of which echo into the present. History also tells us stories of progress, of justices restored. For example, the 1936 maritime strike, which reshaped the Torres Straits pearling industry. There were no protections for workers engaged in industrial action in Queensland in 1936, much less First Nation workers. But with great courage and strength, the Torres Strait Islander workers went on strike to protest over wage theft, dangerous working conditions and the right to self-determination. As a result, the nightly curfew restricting their movement was abolished, wages were increased and workers could choose their own crews and control their own boats. In the 1980s, John Kawata, an elder of the Wik people of far north Queensland, led fellow traditional owners to take the then Bjelke-Petersen government to court for the right to purchase the Archer River Cattle Station, a property which encompassed a significant part of the Wik people's country. The Queensland Minister of the day had refused to allow Aboriginal people to buy such a significant piece of land, although they had raised the funds to do so. In 1988, the Supreme Court of Queensland ruled in favour of the Wik peoples and paved the way for the country's first human rights law, only for the state government of the day to declare the property a national park at the 11th hour. In 2010, the Bligh government set in motion the handing back of 75,000 hectares of the Archer Bend National Park to the Wik-Mungathanar peoples. When the British came to Australia and declared there was no system of land ownership, that Australia was terra nullius, that had no effect on Eddie Mabo and other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. In fact, when Eddie Koiki Mabo was working at James Cook University as a groundsman, he learned for the first time that the traditional lands of his people, his land, was actually legally owned by the government. He determined to do something about it. At the time of British arrival, there were around 750,000 living all over this continent. For centuries, they had lived on the land and from the land. They had distinct tribal boundaries which were recognised by each other. They had a system of land tenure that provided for land to be passed down through the generations. Their culture was rich and diverse. They populated the inland deserts and savanna plains, the tropical far north, the mangroves, the swamps, the coastal lands, the rainforests, the mountains and tablelands, from Tasmania in the south to the Murray Islands of the Torres Strait in the north and the west to the Kimberleys. Their lives were a rich tapestry of art, music and dance. Tribal and group rituals were part of daily life and set them apart, but as one with other groups. For the first 200 or so years after Europeans arrived in Australia, they did not recognise the distinct cultures and practices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. The Mabo decision was significant because it heralded a new understanding of the rights of Indigenous people. 5 men from the Torres Strait with little formal education, but who were well versed in the laws and traditions of their own culture, were able to educate the rest of our nation, our politicians, our lawyers, our academics and judges, to understand the intricate system of land ownership that existed in the Murray Islands. In the mid-20th century, Quandamooka woman Udru Nunakal and Miriam woman Dulcie Flower were among First Nation activists and advocates who came together to campaign for recognition and voting rights. They formed organisations including the Federal Council for the Advancement of Aborigines, whose campaigning led to the Commonwealth Government enacting laws in 1962 that gave First Nations people the right to vote in federal elections. Queensland followed suit in 1965, giving Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders their right to vote in state elections. In 1967, a referendum changed our nation's constitution to include First Nations people for the first time. The preamble of the Queensland Constitution now references that the people of Queensland, free and equal citizens of Australia, honour the Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander peoples, the first Australians whose lands, winds and waters we now share, and pay tribute to their unique values and their ancient and enduring cultures, which deepen and enrich the life of our community. And our Queensland Human Rights Act upholds and protects the cultural rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. These are just a few examples of progress we have made as a community and a nation in our relationship with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Progress made in workplace rights, human rights, and the rights to participate in government and decision-making structures. While the arc of history may well bend towards justice, much of the progress we have made so far has been driven by the strength and determination of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples.
Yeah.
In many cases, progress has been made despite opposition from the governments of the day. While we cannot change the past, we can move forward together by facing our history honestly and courageously. We can and we will achieve so much more by working together. Yeah. Mr Speaker, for many generations, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Queenslanders have called for a treaty or treaties to acknowledge their sovereignty and self-determination. Queensland's Path to Treaty journey formally began in 2019 in response to these calls. I do want to acknowledge, though, Mr Speaker, that the Director-General, Chris Sara, first came to see me not as Director-General but in the first term of government to raise this very issue with me. As a government, we committed to building a new way of working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, a way of working that acknowledges, embraces and celebrates the humanity of First Nations peoples and cultures. The Path to Treaty is also about facing up to the truth of our shared history, the good and the bad, so that we can create a new future together. The Eminent Panel and Treaty Working Group began this work by leading 24 public consultations on what a treaty or treaties might mean to Queenslanders. Building on this work, the Treaty Advancement Committee met with peak bodies, local and state governments and experts in different fields to inform the next steps along the path to treaty. The Treaty Advancement Committee report was formally handed over to the Queensland Government on the 12th of October 2021. On the 16th of August 2022, the Queensland Government, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and non-Indigenous Queenslanders signed Queensland's Path to Treaty commitment. In the short months since, an interim independent body has been established to guide the development of legislation and lead truth-telling activities in partnership with Queensland's institutions of memory. I'm pleased to advise the House their work is well underway. I thank them for their work co-designing and refining the legislation I present to the House today. Legislation developed in partnership which will establish an independent First Nations Treaty Institute and a truth-telling and healing inquiry. Yeah. Mr Speaker, the bill will establish a First Nations Treaty Institute to support and prepare First Nations people for treaty negotiations. The Institute will establish a statutory body. It will not represent the state or be party to treaty negotiations. Its function includes developing a treaty-making framework and empowering Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to prepare for and participate in the treaty-making process. Truth-telling about our shared history is fundamental to the process of healing for individuals, communities and our state. And so this bill will also establish the truth-telling and healing inquiry to examine historical and ongoing impacts of colonisation on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in Queensland. Yeah. The inquiry will approach these inquiries in a predominantly non-adversarial and non-legalistic way. Its functions will include inquiring into documenting the effects of colonisation on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples by holding truth-telling sessions or hearings and to undertake their functions in accordance with the terms of reference. The bill also repeals certain provisions of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Communities Justice, Land and Other Matters Act 1984. The provisions identified for repeal have their origins in a policy environment where the Queensland Government controlled the lives and movements of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Queenslanders. Repealing them is an important and necessary step towards righting persistent wrongs of the past and ensuring compatibility with the Human Rights Act 2019. Yeah. Mr Speaker, this bill is the culmination of years of work, over generations. Many hands and many hearts have shaped this piece of legislation, and I thank everybody who has been involved. Yeah. We consulted extensively with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and Queensland Government agencies to ensure a future treaty or treaties is developed with a shared understanding of the true historical circumstances of Queensland and to appreciate more than 65,000 years of First Nations culture, history, law and law. And we are here now standing on the foundations built by so many people before us, Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander and non-Indigenous peoples. Together, we are building momentum for something that will profoundly change the course of our great state.
Yeah.
The path to treaty will create a state where Aboriginal peoples, the Torres Strait Islander peoples and non-Indigenous peoples can thrive together as true equals. Our relationship will be characterised by mutual respect and trust, with self-determination and agency at the core of everything we do together. It will not be easy. There will be bumps along the road. We are walking side by side on a journey that has never before been travelled, a journey that will lead us all into a new chapter in Queensland's history. I commend the bill to the House. Mr Speaker, I move that the bill be now read a first time.